What you're watching on screen would appear to be a VHS tape, like something out of a person's romantic compilation of a close personal friend or family member. And in a way, it is. To the Japanese public, the person washing dishes on screen, Utada Hikaru, was seen as a close personal friend, an idol. And this relationship with the public was one of constant tension. Hey, today let's talk about a really great song called Hikari by Utada Hikaru and its English version Simple and Clean, which is well known from being featured in Kingdom Hearts, a very popular video game in the mid-2000s. In the process, we can touch on a little bit of histories in Japanese music and what it means in terms of how it historically contextualizes the song and stuff. Yeah, stuff. Oh, good motorcycle noise now. So this part is mostly backed by SpinDiddy.com's review of the history of J-pop. So I recommend reading that. I recommend reading books and articles as well. Other than that, and having a conversation with me, this is going to be kind of a quick run through because I'm not going to be able to get super in depth. So Western cultural imports, including music, begin to be seen in Japan in the 19th century as part of Japan's modernization and westernization process that leads to it becoming, for a period of time, a superpower in Asia. Jazz begins to have a great influence in Japanese musical works, but they were still based in pentatonic scales in Japan, which is more commonly how Asian music traditionally, over the thousands of years, has been composed. Japanese jazz musicians became more prominent after World War II because they were entertaining musicians in cafes. A lot of musicians did that as a way to get by. But it also became something of a cultural movement in Japan. It became a musical style that a lot of people really were into and began to embrace and work around, as a lot of Western musical influences that have been so prominent in Japan were becoming more and more important in the Japanese musical lexicon. And that paves the way for kayokyoku, which is denoting the combination of Japanese and Western musical scales in popular music. Both of which, sort of refer to that, but the latter especially in a more pop music sense, in terms of accessibility through technology, in terms of mainstream hits, in terms of more and more westernization, etc. And that includes various genres, including rock and jazz and others. We also see the Japanese musical tradition enka, which was based in some Western influences combined with some Japanese pentatonic influences, thriving more and more behind artists like Shinichi Mori and Fuji Keiko, who will become relevant in this video because she is the mother of Utada Hikaru. In the 70s and 80s, there's a turn towards singer-songwriters of strongly westernized music, and that shapes the new music era in which Japan, which had rapidly been growing economically and technologically, welcomed slick but creative musical exploration, leading to the famous city pop genre and the visual kei genre. This is also when Japanese idols, often affable and conventionally beautiful female pop performers, took over the country's pop culture. J-idols are still a very big part of the Japanese entertainment industry to this day, and there are many different types of J-idols. There's been a lot of sort of changes in the industry. It's an interesting topic that you would have to talk about all on its own. In the 90s, idols fell out of favor, in part because the public was less and less interested in that industry, but J-pop really arose. The term J-pop was coined in the early 90s and referred to this new age of Japanese music, which was very separate from the traditional Japanese pentatonic elements from decades and decades prior, and still had certain elements here and there, but it was up to the discretion of these performers and entertainers to figure out, how to make it accessible, how to make it something that really resembles this Western music, but insert their own experiences into it. You see a lot of rock music and dance music become popular in the 90s. In the late 90s, that is when our hero, the great Utada Hikaru, emerges, becoming perhaps the most important star in the history of Japanese pop. So let's talk about Utada Hikaru. I'm so happy that I get to do this. A brief history of Utada Hikaru. Before we move further, it's important to note that Utada Hikaru, very notably a year or so ago, came out as being non-binary. And she uses they and she pronouns, so I'll be alternating between the two for the rest of this video. Okay, so there's this really kind of obscure but just super sick video on YouTube of Utada Hikaru, aged 17, having a conversation with the late great Alia, who was, if you don't know, one of the most formative artists in R&B and pop music in the late 90s and early 2000s. A living legend when she was living and still very young, and tragically passed in the early 2000s in a plane accident, but her impact is still felt to this day. Utada Hikaru was able to interview her for this radio program and was talking to her with this enthusiasm. Like, you could tell that Hikaru was young, 17, polished in certain ways in terms of their ability to have a conversation, but there's also like hints of a New York accent coming out because Utada Hikaru was raised in New York. We'll get into that. You can tell that Hikaru is a huge fan, and in fact, if you don't know anything about her, watching this video, you might not know that at that time she was already one of the preeminent stars in Japanese pop music. So Hikaru was born in New York City to record producer Utada Teruzane and aforementioned enka star Keiko Fuji, and Hikaru's experiences with the tolls of fame and the music industry date back to her childhood because they were witnessing at a young age the frustrations and very complex emotional difficulties that their mother, Keiko Fuji, was dealing with. I'm having a hard time keeping up with a coherent naming structure because of the different sources that I was using. So sometimes the surname is gonna go first and sometimes it's gonna go second, baby. We're just improvising here. We're doing it all off the top of the dome. So in this video, I have multiple quotes from Utada Hikaru's book 10, an autobiography from the mid-2000s. These are translated by this amazing Tumblr page called Kimono Beat. I had to go on the Wayback Machine. Thank you so much to Voakka, by the way, for doing this, like figuring this out for me. I had to go back on the Wayback Machine on the archive and get these pages because I couldn't find them in the internet now, and I was able to find Kimono Beat's amazing translation, so go check those out if you know how to do that. So here's some quotes. A quote about Utada Hikaru's relationship with her mother. When we went out together, my mom always seemed to be really bothered when people realized she was Fuji Keiko. She looked a bit hurt. All that made me think was that being famous is awful. Lots of people would gather around us for various reasons, and I hated those people. So this is the foundation for the relationship that Utada Hikaru would be dealing with the public years later. And it's a very interesting sort of theme that we'll sort of touch on later when we talk about the lyrical aptitude of Utada Hikaru and the topics she addresses in her songs, because it's just amazing what she's able to bring out of her experiences and create into this positive thing. In this book, Hikaru also talks about the complex emotions they dealt with as a result of constant moving between Japan and the US. It was very common for me to be told before I went to bed at night that we had to go back to Japan the next day and move without even being able to say goodbye to my classmates. Having realized my own helplessness against parents like those, I grew up to be a well-behaved and smart child. I had nervous breakdowns over playing cards and loved puzzles, reading, drawing pictures, playing pretend, and playing with stuffed animals. I have memories up until I was about 5 years old of being frustrated and crying whenever I lost at a game or couldn't play the piano well because I hated losing so much. Eventually, I became a kid who didn't cry even when I was upset or sad because my mom got extremely angry with me when I cried in front of her. For some reason, it hurt her feelings and she cried, even though I was the one who was sad and crying, so I blamed myself. As a result, she discouraged me from it. Instead, I came to know about a sadness even deeper than crying. I knew that I hadn't meant any harm to her, and in almost frigid and unfeeling way, scary from the very core of my being. It's incredible, like this prose, right? Of course, this is a translation by an unofficial translation, but the layers of these thoughts, like these emotional realities, you can see already that Hikaru, you know, at least when she's reflecting on her childhood, is talking about emotions that are much more layered and much more hard to parse through and difficult than just what we conceive of as the typical emotions of happiness and sadness. So the beginnings of Hikaru making music started from very young. She was in the studio often with her parents, and they had encouraged her to make music in English. It was an innocent thing, and then one thing led to another, and an EMI producer wanted to have Utada Hikaru to do a whole album. And so she actually made this album. It was entirely in English, and it was like R&B and hip hop. Her artist name was Cubic U at that time, and it's actually accessible on YouTube. You can listen to the whole thing now. And it's very raw. It's not the most polished album. You can still see so many traces. I mean, she's writing music, and she's like 13. It's unbelievable the talent that she had in terms of composition and these ideas, incredibly creative, but it was very raw, and it was definitely a period where also Utada Hikaru wasn't entirely comfortable with what was going on. She was just kind of seeing things out, feeling things out. And it turned out the experience with the Western EMI was not the most endearing thing for her. Somehow or another, it was decided that I would be making an album with the American branch of EMI. Thinking about it now, it's a wonder why I accepted such a thing, even though I'd never even thought about becoming a singer. But at 13 years old, I wrote songs without putting any thought into it at all and recorded them. I didn't want to say that I couldn't do it. I also didn't want to turn down an offer my parents worked so hard to arrange. Made the album, then for some reason EMI USA dissolved and the album was left up in the air. I didn't really think anything of it, nothing changed. The only thing that did was that we had a great number of troubles regarding the people who had to do with production, money, and rights come up. So I learned about society then. That's the way those kinds of people are, I thought without a trace of anger. I also kind of thought that my parents were lenient in comparison. So again, negative experiences with the music industry, first from seeing it through their mother, and then next in their own experiences as a young teenager and seeing shadiness. But this was of course not the end of Utada Hikaru's magical journey in the music industry, because when they were 14, they get approached by a Japanese producer. One day when I was 14 years old, we stopped by a studio in downtown Tokyo because of some work my parents had. Apparently when I was there, I caught the eye of then Toshiba EMI producer Miyake Akira. Like, there's a junior high girl here for some reason. I wonder who she is. The next day, Mr. Miyake, knowing my background, contacted me about making music in Japanese, and once again I accepted without putting any thought into it. Then a memorable moment. I wrote my very first Japanese song, Never Let Go. So she goes on to describe that process, producing the first song, the excitement, just the kind of naivete of it, and then goes on to describe how song 2 and 3 was literally automatic and Time Will Tell, which became the debut single of Utada Hikaru, and boy oh boy, what a hit. But we're not here to talk about that first love record, maybe another day. We're gonna talk about Hikari, which comes on the third album. However, before we get there, I do want to note something else from the autobiography, just in general about their notes on writing lyrics, because I want you to sort of think about these things once we start talking about these songs and their lyrics and their themes. After my debut, I had a hard time because I started getting asked how I wrote lyrics. Never thought about that before, like they just kind of come up. I still think the best answer I ever gave was when I was 19. I might have said something like this during a conversation I was having with my director, Mr. Okita. It feels like when you're trying hard to untangle a necklace that's twisted and knotted up. I express things that look complicated at first glance as simply as I can. I guess I feel the same about being alive. The process is similar to purifying and concentrating something, a process that won't work if you're afraid of cutting things out. Let's talk about Hikari. So after debuting with the album First Love, which has sold 11 million units worldwide, and then following up with the sophomore effort Distance, which is the highest selling Japanese album of the decade, Utada's third album, Deep River, features the closing track Hikari, and that was written to be featured on Tetsuya Nomura's video game project, Kingdom Hearts. We're just gonna gloss over the ridiculous success that Utada Hikaru was having in Japan as a literal fucking teenager. Like, when I was 18, I couldn't even get a lead role in college theater. So, yeah, Nomura was enthusiastic about pursuing a still teenage Utada Hikaru to lead this project musically. This is from an IGN article from back in the day. Utada is the only artist I envisioned singing the theme song for Kingdom Hearts, said Kingdom Hearts' director Nomura. Her music has moved millions of fans, and I was absolutely thrilled when she agreed to contribute to this project. I see her as an icon for young artists, and she also proves that music transcends national and language barriers. I'm so interested in this sort of time period, even though I wish I could get more information on it. I don't speak Japanese. If I did, I would probably be able to research better. But I'm really interested in terms of how these cultural products are produced and the different thinking that goes into it. Especially when it came to Kingdom Hearts, there was this concerted effort to really incorporate Japanese musicians in the Square Enix stuff in general. I mean, I remember when Final Fantasy X-2 comes out, and 10. Kumi Koda sang 2 like original songs in Japanese and English for those soundtracks. And then when you have Kingdom Hearts, you have Utada Hikaru. They literally were like, you know, Kingdom Hearts, this massive project where you're combining Disney and Square Enix and all these worlds and bridging West and East in this dramatic way. We have to incorporate this artist who best showcases that almost West versus East idea in Utada Hikaru, who's Japanese American, but also there's a quality that she has aside from just being popular that makes her like the ideal artist for a project like this. There's an interesting talk that John Lee does at the York Center, by the way, with insight about how the Japanese economy and how the Japanese entertainment industries sort of domesticate after the economic crisis of the 90s, and how different that is from, say, South Korea's Hallyu movement of globalizing. And of course, Japan's entertainment industry is known to be very sort of secluded. So it's very interesting too to see that balance where this is a time period where they saw Utada Hikaru as potentially bridging that gap. And you had to make, of course, as a person in their position, music in different languages, music for different markets. It was always a project that was going to have its troubles. I mean, there were numerous records that came after this by Utada that were in English and for the American market, and it was a lot of mixed reception on that. But nothing has quite hit like Simple and Clean. Hikari I'll talk about first, and I won't delve into it too much because again, I don't speak Japanese, and so even though I very much encourage people to read translations of music that isn't in English, it also makes it a bit difficult to have the right conversation about it because I can't come from it from a place of really interpreting the nuances of translation. I'm gonna go with Kimono Beat's translation of this song and just point out some different lines that I think are really fascinating. There's multiple themes that sort of permeate through both versions of the song, Hikari and Simple and Clean, but they're definitely not a translation of one another. Hikari means light in Japanese, and that's the name of the Japanese song. And a lot of the lyrics come back to this idea of this light that a person brings and represents. And on the other hand, Simple and Clean, written in English, sort of opts for a bit more abstract and straightforward imagery at the same time, because instead of saying, you know, comparing a person to a light, it's very much talking about wanting things to be what they are in the moment and wanting things to be simple and clean. The thing about these lyrics is it's so hard to sort of converse about them in a coherent way sometimes, because one of Utada Hikaru's greatest strengths as a songwriter is that they just eschew clarity. They eschew the idea of having to be super linear and super, you know, obvious with songwriting, and that makes these lyrics extremely complicated. You don't necessarily have an easy takeaway from what the message of the song is. You have to think about it and you have to process it, and it allows for her to be so much more emotive with her songwriting because she's just choosing the lyrics that almost feel perfect for untangling her emotions, like she was talking about in that quote earlier from the book. And so as a result, you get these phrases and these ideas communicated that might seem like they contradict each other a lot, but that also feel extremely more conversational and natural because they feel like these different thoughts that kind of clash against each other and the average person's head when it comes to relationships and stresses. The translation that Kimono Beat says has this lyric: I guess nowadays promises just make me feel anxious. I just want to tell you what I'm wishing for. I'll introduce you to my family. I'm sure it'll go well. Like, this idea of introducing the person to the family is this theme that comes up quite a bit because it's this very weird, like, inauspicious thing. It's like, I have to introduce you to my family. That's like one of those things that you do in a relationship, and it's seen as this very committal thing, and it's almost a dangerous thing, a stressful thing. And it's one of those things that you compare with the ideal of a relationship that just takes you out of your stresses and brings you to this very emotional and connective place above everything. Stop doing pointless things like looking too far ahead. Let's eat something delicious today. The future is still a long ways ahead. Even I can't know what it will be like because we should shoot one scene at a time. Not perfecting it, just making it better. The light called you will flash on my scenario. Just this, you know, just these ideas like the future, I can't worry about it. I don't know what it's going to be like. Well, let's be living in the moment, not one scene at a time. We're not going to try to be perfect, but we're going to make it better. Like, very, you know, wholesome ideas, but at the same time not wholesome to the degree where it's like oversimplifying everything and making it seem like everything is going to be okay, but more so being like, let's have some sort of resolve, right? Let's have this resolve. That's how I'm, sort of interpreting the kimono beat translation of these lyrics. I think that they're probably accurate. Maybe they're not. It'd be interesting to hear other people's perspectives on that, but it's interesting when you contrast that with Simple and Clean. So the fact of Utada being able to write a song completely differently in 2 versions in 2 different languages at the age of 19 and have both of them be remarkable like works that are super popular. Like, again, when I was 19, that was when I first realized how to cut my hair. Not even to do it myself, but like what to tell the barber. You know what I mean? Both Hikari and Simple and Clean speak really powerfully about contradictions, distractions, worries, and complexities of relationships and just growing up. In this contrast, like weighed against a love that feels like a perfect escape in a moment. Like, this moment with you is the moment that everything feels completely simple and fine, and I would just love to stay there. But can I? But can we? I think there's more of a questioning and more of a confusion and a desire, a desperation almost that's being expressed when I read the Simple and Clean lyrics as opposed to when I read a translation of Hikari, which is more of a resolve, right? After the chorus, the first verse of Simple and Clean is, "You're giving me too many things lately." Like, what a way to start a verse. "You're all I need." You smiled at me and said, "Don't get me wrong, I love you, but does that mean I have to meet your father?" See the idea of the family meeting again. "When we are older, you'll understand what I meant when I said, no, I don't think life is quite that simple." What does Hikaru mean by that? What do they mean by, I don't think life will be that simple? Is it to say that this is the way that it has to be? Or is it to say that this is the simple thing? Or is it to say that it would be so much simpler if you didn't have to do that? It's confusing. In the same regard, like, that's exactly what these kinds of situations are like, right? When you're in these relationships and you're processing all these complex emotions, especially when you're like 19, like Hikaru Utada, at that moment, it's like, is it simple? What is the simplest way? Is the simplest way to just put your head down and say, like, let's just do the hard thing that's so stupid or feels ridiculous, or let's just eschew it, let's just say screw it, let's just, like, oh man, God. I'm so glad I'm not 19 anymore, by the way. It's hard to understand exactly where the speaker is landing in terms of how they feel about the relationship in Simple and Clean, whether they're simply letting go of these apparent serious matters or whether they're just gonna confront them and not care. The daily things like this and that and what is what that keep us all busy are confusing me. That's when you came to me and said, "Wish I could prove I love you, but does that mean I have to walk on water? When we are older, you'll understand it's enough when I say so, and maybe some things are that simple." It's like there's somewhere that second verse is going where it's like this resolution, but I just don't quite understand like a narratively convenient way to explain that. It's just like there's almost like resolve that is building in the author. It's almost like Hikari is speaking to Simple and Clean. It's like Simple and Clean is so much more in the perspective of like, I don't even know where I'm going, but I need to start making this discovery for myself. And then Hikari is like describing the discovery. I don't know. What I do want to talk about before we get to the conclusion is that there's this everyman kind of nature that Hikaru Utada really puts forth in her music, which is this remarkable thing that really speaks to also, like, if we understand their experiences in life with understanding how stardom and how the industry and the spotlight can really take you apart, or all these different situations can make you feel small and make you feel huge at the same time. It makes so much sense, right? That her resolve is to say, you know what, I want to make music where I can relate to any person. I want to make music about the everyday experiences that we all have. You notice, like, with that music video and with the lyrics, that there is this positioning of Hikaru Utada to say, like, I'm washing dishes, I'm having regular relationship problems, I'm confused, this is a complicated situation that we all go through, rather than like, look at me, right? There's this we that's present, you know what I mean? Like this we voice, instead of saying like it's based in I, right? But there's this very we thing about it, of like, we all have these struggles. Even in some of the lyrics of the songs, like the daily things that keep us all busy are confusing me, right? There's this singular individual perspective, but it's an individual perspective that's based in understanding a collective experience and how to process it in a way that anybody can relate to. It's this that, you know, and I'm not going to do a long video about Kingdom Hearts, but I remember Kingdom Hearts growing up. I have such fond memories of this song and its relationship with that video game. And this song being so remarkable is so crucial, honestly, to the branding of the game. If this was just like a cheesy song that felt very standard in terms of its songwriting, even if it was good, it would very much lower the sort of prestige and like the elevation and the power that's felt in that game. It's the way that this song is so connected with the human experience that makes Kingdom Hearts this game that you look at from this perspective of like you feel connected with that human experience. And a lot of it was also the storytelling of the video game, but it's perfectly coincided with Utada Hikaru making this song of like, this is what we all go through. This is this thing with relationship and with love and with confusion and complexity and growing up that we are all dealing with. And so when you're playing Kingdom Hearts, it's almost like you're experiencing that as well through Sora, right? But also with the themes of that music, with the different travels through the game. And like it's just perfect. You just completely understand. You perfectly understand why they're like, nah, we need to get Utada to do this song, bro. Like it has to be Utada, right? Because who else could do that? There's a quote from 10 that I'll share here. I feel as if defining myself like, I'm a woman, I live in Tokyo, I'm young, I like this, I hate that, treat me this way, I'm scared of this. And just listing things about who I am limits me. I don't get why people are so interested in this way of thinking, clearly marking the boundary between in and out by saying, I'm like this or that. On the contrary, I want to share something in common with the whole world. There it is. First, sometimes it's the lyrics that confuse us or that feel super complicated that stick with us the most, especially when they're written so beautifully and naturally, like Utada's are. You know, when you're reading a book, you want a narrative cohesion generally, right? You want to understand what's going on in the prose. But when you read poetry or when you listen to music, you want those lyrics or those, you know, those stanzas to evoke something. And that allows for so much room and a suggestion almost to be abstract, to be daring. And so that's what makes their songwriting so strong sometimes, that they are able to just be like, let me evoke something rather than try to be super narratively tight. And it's this refreshing thing, right? This is what is the great quality of Hikaru Utada. When we look at the music industry and these ideas of East meets West and soft power, it's like there's this corporatization and this governmentization of like this idea of East meets West and creating these large cultural products, etc., etc. And it can be very easy to lose sight of the everyman nature of it. You know, there's this Adorno way of looking at culture industries as like being created to make us feel like we're engaged in culture and politics when we're actually not. Basically using music, media, film to subdue us. And maybe there is a degree to which that is true. But I also think that when you listen to a song like Simple and Clean, the kind of emotion that it evokes and the kind of realizations that it can help you have are things that you would never expect from something that in a lot of ways you can characterize as like a project for a massive media project, right? Like it's literally like write the song for a big hit video game that's gonna be a big hit, right? And Utada Hikaru still used that moment to be like, I want to relate to you. I want to speak to you. And that's why Simple and Clean stands the test of time, not just because it was so popular at the time, not just because it was in a super famous video game, but because it's singular. It's compositionally, lyrically, and thematically singular, right? There's nothing like it, and there's no one like Hikaru Utada. So I send my love and appreciation to Hiki and to Hiki's fans. If you haven't listened to their music, go stream all of it. They have a new album that is really sick that just came out this year. Still at it, still killing it. And yeah, go listen to Simple and Clean. And thanks for watching. My Ko-fi is in the description if you want to send a tip for my video. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you to everybody for helping me out. Thank you to voakka again for the research help. Thank you to Kimono Beat for me using all of your translations. And thank you. You're doing pretty good today. You're having a pretty good day. No? Not having a good day? It's all right. Tomorrow. You'll get them tomorrow. Bye.